for the last 4 months. But the situation is getting worse and worse, and particularly in places where money is involved, and that's exactly the industries where PCI is applied. A couple of quotes related to PCI. VeriSign says over 50% of organizations fail 6.6 specifically in their PCI compliance audits.
Sure.
Forrester Research says that SQL injection caused by poor coding is one of the top 5 causes of PCI failures overall. And PCI covers, we'll see later on, covers more than just coding standards. So this is saying basically that the application component of PCI compliance is an important one.
Too, right? Just for the video.
Ah, now we've got 2 mics. Excellent.
Well, it's just for the video, so.
Very good. And finally, we see that Section 6 is becoming an increasing cause of failures for PCI compliance overall. So in 2006, it was the number 9 cause of failures. In 2007, it was up to number 2. I don't know what the number is going to be for 2008, but it's certainly looking worse. So the agenda for today is we're going to do a brief overview of Section 6.6, Section 6 in general, 6.6 specifically. Quick show of hands. Who's familiar with PCI overall? You guys more or less know what I'm talking about, right? Okay, that's what I expected. I figured it'd be kind of a self-selecting group. People who want to hear about this probably know something about it already. Then we're going to go over a technology comparison of source code analysis, penetration testing, and application firewalls. We'll look at some case studies of customers, users who have deployed each of these 3 technologies. And then we'll look at some guidance from the people who are responsible for evaluating compliance in terms of how people actually demonstrate that they've complied with Section 6 and what they did to do so. So what is PCI compliance? The PCI Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard is a set of 12 security guidelines, IT security guidelines that impact any organization that processes or stores, transmits information related to credit cards. Who has to comply with that? Obviously, anyone who does any of those things. When do they have to do it? Now, and they have to demonstrate that again and again every year. It's important to note also that level 1 merchants actually have some form of outside or reproducible audit. Level 2 and below, meaning smaller organizations, don't have to have that verified from the outside. Basically, they are doing self-reporting, self-assessment. So a little bit on the timeline and evolution of these standards. Early on, credit card industry, different brands developed their own guidelines, Visa and MasterCard in particular, for merchants that were going to process their credit card transactions. In early 2005, they decided to bring these together into the payment card industry standard and have an integrated standard for all credit card processing organizations. Then there was the card systems breach, 40 million identities, personal information compromised. And pretty soon thereafter, we saw the addition of Section 6.6, which was specifically related to application security. Overall, I've got on the next slide, PCI covers a variety of IT security constraints. 6.6 is specifically related to application security. And although it's not obvious that card systems was the breach that led to this, it certainly couldn't have hurt in adding this application security component because the card system breach was related to an application level security problem. Then in early 2007, we see the TJX exploit. And soon thereafter, we see PCI pushing some of the responsibility for verification and assessment down to the banks. So they say now the banks need to assess individual merchants who they process transactions for, as opposed to some external entity or PCI taking on this responsibility themselves. We see the Hannaford breach soon thereafter. Hannaford is an interesting case because they had demonstrated PCI compliance, they passed a PCI audit, and then they were breached afterwards. And this doesn't necessarily undermine the legitimacy of the standard, but it certainly suggests this ongoing evolution of making the standard more and more precise, adding more and more detail in terms of what compliance means, so that the credit card organizations, individual merchants, and end users can better understand what an organization that has demonstrated compliance has actually done, what that means. There was a paper in early 2008 that clarified Section 6.6. We'll talk about some of the points that made, but basically this is a further evolution of the standard to make it very precise what it is organizations need to do to demonstrate compliance. And the important one for, I imagine, a lot of you is that Section 6.6 went from being an optional or recommended component of the standard to being a requirement in June of this year. So that's been a big shift in the industry, both from a merchant perspective and from a evaluation and assessment perspective. And finally, this week, hopefully, we've got Section 1.2 coming out. From what I've seen, I expect this is going to be further clarification. No radical changes that I'm aware of, but I guess we'll see. So, PCI requirements overall, 12 standards. Section 6 is the one we're most interested in, develop and maintain secure systems and applications. But you can think of application security and the technologies we're going to talk about today being somewhat relevant to some of these other sections as well. So how do you demonstrate that you're protecting stored data? How do you demonstrate that you're transmitting and encrypting data appropriately? And then, of course, how are you testing your systems? And that comes more in the runtime testing, penetration testing aspect. But these technologies do apply outside of Section 6, so when you're evaluating, considering them, it's important to think about not only how are you going to demonstrate compliance with Section 6, but also what other sections of PCI compliance they may be relevant to. So, Section 6.6 reads, ensure that all web-facing applications are protected against known attacks by applying either of the following methods. Having all custom application code reviewed for common vulnerabilities by an organization that specializes in application security, or installing an application layer firewall in front of web-facing applications. And the paper I mentioned that was published earlier this year to clarify what those points means further states that automated tools are acceptable, so we're not talking necessarily about a human performing this analysis, that penetration testing is an acceptable solution to meet the code review requirement, and the team performing the assessment can be internal, so you're not talking about necessarily bringing someone in from outside the organization. And all three of these points have pretty significant impact on how an organization, a merchant, is going to demonstrate compliance and what technologies they might choose.
Not to interrupt you much, but that's all web-facing applications that process payment cards.
Yes, of course. Sorry. So the whole standard applies to applications that are processing, transmitting, storing payment information, credit card information.
So you can pass PCI and still have a really crappy web browser, as long as it doesn't do any of the...
As long as it doesn't touch any of the relevant data, absolutely. Transactions, yeah, certainly.
In terms of application penetration testing, which organization, with internal organization, can perform that?
Okay, so moving on to the next case study. So this company chose to deploy penetration testing. They were a top 3 consumer magazine publisher, a very big company, $46 billion in revenue, level 1 merchant as well. They had 150 plus developers in-house, and the person that we talked to was the CISO, the Chief Information Security Officer. Okay, so here we go again. Setup and optimization. So similar trends here as with source code analysis. So setup was harder than expected. It wasn't a 1, but it was a 2, harder than they expected. And optimization was, again, kind of a pleasant surprise. They were able to customize it to their environment more quickly than they expected. Performance, similar to source code analysis, they had expectations for how long it would take to run the pen test and expectations for what the hardware requirements would be. Those were met. No big surprises for them there. Human resources, they expected it to be very easy, and I think talking to this person, they had put a lot of weight in the auto-crawl feature of penetration testing tools, where you just hit the button and it runs and scans. And they found that they didn't take it down to a 1, but they did find that it required some manual effort to actually customize the tool and to work with it to make sure it actually covers more of the application, because they found on the auto-crawl, the coverage was fairly low right off the bat. In terms of expertise required in